Welcome, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for coming. So my name's Carrie Schneider. Thank you all for being here, and thanks to, oh, by the way, this microphone is for the recording, so when people are speaking into it, it's not just an imaginary prop. So thank you to Humanities Texas for funding this program, and thank you to JP, who helped advise me throughout the process of creating this program as well. We're here in the Charge House at Project Row Houses as a part of Round 44, Artists, Activists, and Instigators. I hope you've had a chance to look at the installations in all the house, as well as get to learn about Project Row Houses, which is a 21-year-old institution dedicated to showing and incubating the culture of African American artists in the Third Ward. It's a nationally and internationally renowned art space, and Rick would normally be giving that intro, but that's a little tidbit, and I hope that you guys all have a chance to walk through it. So Jenny and I co-organized Charge. It asks artists to consider how, not only by intersecting with other organizing fields, but within our own art field itself, there are issues of equity at stake. Our aim is ultimately that not only artists who can afford to work for free get to create our culture, but that everyone has access to add to our public imagination. Charge was born in the context of Houston touting its arts in its pitch to be considered a world-class city, forefronting its arts in bids for the Super Bowl, advertising its arts as a way to attract and retain the workforce of major industries, and also making policy around the arts in the recently written cultural plan. But in the midst of all this attention on the arts, there were no artist voices at the table. So we thought, being artists, we'll create our own table. We have had 2 convenings hosted by Art League Houston, which platform artists who have inspiring models of sustaining both their work and their lives, artists whose work intersects with activist communities, and artists who consider their work in relation to the larger economy. We did this in 2014 and also this past January, and documentation of that is in this space. It's a way for us to share knowledge and support alternatives horizontally, starting and centering on the artist's ground up. So we were excited to be invited to the round at Project Row Houses to actually build this physical table as an extension of our sort of metaphoric mission statement table, attempting to kind of give equal platform to the multiple voices around it, even though it's a collage of different sources. And I guess I just want to say that I'm really honored and humbled to get to be here today, reaching out to so many storytellers here who have so much experience, and to kind of add something else to the imagination of how we think of Houston. You know, Houston doesn't only equal business friendly, but there's a lot of stories, undertold stories about labor organizing in the city as well. So each of our wonderful storytellers is going to have up to 5 minutes to bring one of these stories to light. And then at the end, we'll have time for Q&A from you guys, as well as if anyone has something that they want to share, a story that they know about. We are going to go through the whole thing, so please hold your applause and comments until the end. And also, we're going to start and end with storytellers who weren't able to be physically present, but who we have videos of.
On February 25th, 1946, the streets of Houston overflowed with garbage. 1,000 municipal employees, trash collectors among them, declared a citywide strike. As in other cities in the United States and throughout Europe, Houston's workers greeted the end of World War II intent on securing and extending wartime labor gains for the post-Depression, post-war future. City trash collectors and street, sewer, and water main repair workers complained that their wages remained far lower than their counterparts in private industry and didn't keep pace with the rising cost of living. Beyond these bread and butter issues, workers protested the caustic and insulting remarks and threats made by city officials. With demands for wage increases and improved working conditions, Houston's municipal workers left their posts and took to the streets. Inescapable and putrid, the uncollected trash evoked both the workers' discontent and their centrality to the city's very functioning. A casual observer in 1946 would have been surprised by this demonstration of labor militancy. Among city residents, trade union members, and business leaders, Houston hardly had a reputation as a bastion of working-class radicalism, despite the history of labor organizing in the oil industry. Before the war, the union presence in the city was moderate at best, heavily segregated along racial lines, and concentrated among middle-class blue-collar workers. The labor-backed mayoral candidate in the 1942 election, for example, finished dead last. Convinced that this labor upsurge would not last long, the city's political leadership held a hard line at the beginning of the strike. Mayor Otis Massey and the city council refused to negotiate with the strikers until they returned to work, and they rebuffed union representatives altogether. Acting city manager J.M. Nagel argued that the city had simply fired employees who, quote, had resigned by failing to report for work. He said these workers actually quit voluntarily. We're issuing their final checks, and they've lost all their civil service, seniority, and pension rights. Mayor Massey agreed. He said, so far as I'm concerned, those who are off the job are no longer in a position to bargain with us. They're simply former city employees. The city council planned to call on state officials and the Texas Rangers to declare martial law. Massey encouraged Houstonians to weather the strike by volunteering to pick up garbage and clean the streets themselves. Yet the strikers didn't fold quickly, as city officials predicted. Trash remained uncollected 5 days after the strike began, leaving streets and sidewalks cluttered with overflowing garbage pails and barrels. When the city made plans to contract out to private industries to cover these municipal services, the City County Employees Union threatened to bring the picket lines to the contractors' offices. After this announcement, the city couldn't find any companies willing to handle its business. To the city father's chagrin, much of Houston's working class seemed to take the strikers' side. When the city secured a court order against the striking unions to prevent them from picketing water, sewage and gas plants, and garbage truck lots, 300 additional union members not covered by the injunction joined the picket line. The relief picketers included garbage collectors, infrastructure repair workers, electricians, carpenters, painters, plumbers, many of them not even employed by the city, but in private companies. By the third day, the Houston Building Trade Council's 20,000 members pledged to back the striking workers. To make things even worse for the city, the scabs the city anticipated never materialized. On the picket line, City County Employees Union President Oscar Duncan addressed a few workers who did take these municipal jobs during the strike. He told them the city flat out turned us down for a raise. Come along and be fair with us. Don't work. The newly hired workers quit on the spot and joined the picket line too. Houston workers' support for the strike grew as the fight wore on. Taxi drivers, bakers, barbers, longshoremen, musicians, office employees, packing house workers, and railroad clerks swelled the ranks of the striking workers, with 1,200 dock workers and 700 taxi drivers joining the original 1,000 striking municipal employees in an overwhelming demonstration of solidarity. Spurred by the solidarity strikes, Houston Labor and Trades Council Secretary George A. Wilson called on 65 AFL locals in the city to march on City Hall in support of the fired workers, to respond to what he called the arrogance and utter lack of consideration of the mayor and the city council of the welfare of the city employees and the citizens of Houston. By some estimates, as many as 10,000 workers marched on City Hall that day. As Building Trades Council President Ellie Patrick put it, it's not only a city employee fight now, but it concerns all labor. Ultimately, the city agreed to investigate its wage rates and to bring wages in line with those in the private sector. It was not a resounding victory, to be sure, but this strike, the largest in Texas history, made clear that workers in Houston embraced their identities as workers. The strike united garbage collectors, dock and oil industry workers, and white-collar employees as part of a common class determined to forge the city's future. The Houston of 1946 was quite different from today's Houston 70 years later. But we might ask how this vision was possible once, and how it could become so again.
So in order to get a contextual understanding for the labor history of Texas, you need to know something about how Texas came into the Union. That is to say that in 1836, when the much touted Texas Republic came into being, it originated in no small measure as a revolt against the abolition of slavery in Mexico. And therefore, Stephen F. Austin and his comrades, not unlike those who revolted against the United States in 1861 to start the U.S. Civil War, seceded from Mexico and set up the independent state of Texas. But the problem was that they were under so much pressure from the international abolitionist forces, not least British abolitionists and Haitian revolutionary abolitionists, that Texas folded and entered the Union in 1845 in order to escape that kind of pressure, and then, of course, seceded with Dixie in 1861. Now, in terms of the labor history in particular, you should know that the enslaved Africans in Texas had a noticeable reputation for militancy. Those who have smartphones might want to put into your search engine box the Texas terror so-called of 1860, 1861, when there were these credible rumors that there was going to be a mass uprising of the enslaved Africans in Texas. And of course, they were working for free. And like many people who were forced into that kind of position, they were always on the edge of revolt. In terms of the modern history of Texas labor, one place to begin is with the National Maritime Union, which comes into existence in the 1930s. It's led by radicals. It's led by communists, including a Jamaican communist by the name of Ferdinand Smith. They have a particularly strong base of support in Galveston and Beaumont. They were a union that was not afraid to go on strike. It was a union that was not afraid to engage in militant action. But since I'm speaking to artists, I should also mention the great Paul Robeson, who was a Black American artist born in 1898, dies in 1976, perhaps the greatest star of stage, screen, and concerts in the 1930s and the 1940s. But because of his own militancy, particularly on behalf of Hollywood labor unions, that is to say, the screenwriters, the directors, the actors, the camera persons, the set designers, the makeup people, etc. He was, quote, blacklisted, unquote. And oftentimes it only takes the effort to beat one slave to keep the entire plantation online. And since the so-called blacklisting of Paul Robeson in the 1950s, many artists have taken the signal that it does not pay to get involved in politics, certainly not in labor militancy. So they've steered clear of that particular mode of operation. I should also mention the Service Employees International Union, which has had a strong base of support throughout the state of Texas. You know that it's spearheading the fight for 15 nationally, that is to say the fight for a living wage of $15 an hour. They've been picketing fast food joints across the country and including in Texas, and have had some success, particularly in New York State and in California and in Seattle, Washington. And I dare say that the Service Employees International Union is one union that any concerned with progressivism and labor unions and labor militancy and labor activism should ally with, the SEIU. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. So I wasn't expecting that little shout out to SEIU. I'm actually Elsa Caballero. I'm the president of, I'm the president of SEIU Texas. You might know us as the Janitors Union. So I was going to tell you, at least my story is going to have a little bit about how we got here. Back in 2000, probably 2005 is when we started organizing Houston janitors here. And when we first started, I would say, it really became clear that this was really a fight, not just about income inequality for those workers, but also about respect, dignity and respect, and having them sort of come out of the shadows, because as you know, many people didn't even know who they were. They found their buildings clean in the morning, but no one really paid attention to who did that work. It's also a community that's an immigrant community who is very fearful of speaking out. So when they first organized, that was one of the biggest challenges, to get people to, one, be willing to speak out and tell their story. As you know, in 2006, those workers, in order to actually get a contract, had to go on strike, where you actually had the horses coming out and the harassment to the workers and the ability and their ability to express themselves in civil disobedience. I would also say that we had organizers being harassed by the police and being pulled over as we were going into the buildings and we were going into action. So it was really surprising to me that, we had such a huge strike in the 40s, and then having to have the problems that we had when we were trying to organize the Houston janitors. I would say that the struggle continues. We still have contractors and companies who feel that, their best attack is to intimidate workers and coming in and trying to completely dismantle the work that they'd done even 10 years after. In 2012, when we came back, after we'd had already a strike, contractors came in and basically said they wanted to get rid of, everything that these workers had fought for during the first strike. And we had to have another strike that lasted a whole entire month where these workers, decided to stand up. It wasn't about income as much as it was just protecting what they've earned. During that strike, I actually decided for the first time to do civil disobedience. I've never done civil disobedience before, never gotten arrested. But it was the most impactful experience I've ever had. I'd heard stories about what happened in 2006. I heard about having people spend 24 hours in jail and longer, being told that they had to have $1 million of bond to get out, which was ridiculous. But I didn't actually believe it until I had to experience it myself. So I went in at noon one day, didn't come back out till noon the next day, only because they were refusing to put what charges we had, and they were, as long as you don't have charges, they can't post you bail. So they were trying to send a message to us. I would say that it was interesting during that night. The people that were getting picked up and coming into jail, it seemed like they went to sort of raid all the after-hour clubs, all the cantinas and everything. And so the people that were there were, very diverse group of people. The ladies that were there, it was pretty funny. Everybody was actually asking us, why are you here? What happened? And, the funny story was, I was like, well, we sat on the street and we got arrested for it. I was like, oh, wow. So, one of the ladies there actually said to me, she said, okay, so you got arrested for sitting in your butt. I got arrested for shaking my butt. So I thought that was kind of funny because it only took for me to sit down on my butt and I got arrested. She got actually out before I did. But I thought it was, I would share that funny story. I would tell you that for us, what's really clear now, we just actually settled our third contract. I think we're in the fourth contract now. We didn't have to go on strike on this year, but what was really clear for us, and I think the way that we're changing our fight is that we now understand that our fight is not just about income inequality, but it's also about racial inequality. Because if we don't deal with our racial inequality here in this country, we know that we're never going to be able to achieve the income equality that we're looking for. So I'm excited about the work. I'm excited to continue to work with Houston janitors, and we're excited to have low-wage workers sort of join that fight. So thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Richard Shaw, and I'm going to tell you a story about another Houston garbage strike that happened in 1986. At the time, I was working for the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees, Local 1550. That particular local was organized in 1958, and you just heard a historian talk about another union local of municipal workers that existed in 1946, which happens to be the year I was born. So in 1986, the city then had roughly the same council that we've got now in terms of numbers, -2. And our mayor was Mayor Kathy Whitmire. And the 1980s were a real bad time for Houston because of the downturn in oil. And in 1986, the mayor had laid off by then some 397 municipal workers. And 159 of those were sanitation workers. I'm just going to call them garbage workers for short. And so 159 of them were laid off. Now, I want to take you back to 1986 in picking up garbage. They called it bumping garbage back then. If you've ever seen a rear loader garbage truck, you put everything in through the rear. So the trucks would come by and they would pick up garbage twice a week in Houston. Wednesday was the day off. They had Sunday off as well as Saturday, but Wednesday was the day off during the week. And the truck would go down the street and they would pick up the garbage. It was either in bags, plastic bags, or in cans. And then that can would be bumped into that truck and hit on the side until all of its contents were expelled. There was a limit on the number of pounds you could put in a can. There was even a limit on the number of cans you could put out. But most of the time, those limits were not even observed. And if you ever had any experience picking up garbage, just think of what you can pack into one of those cans. So that's the situation that the workers were in 1986. There had been layoffs. At the time, the workers were working the task system. What that meant was when they came to work very early in the morning, when they finished their route, they went home. And most of the time, those routes were finished about 3 or 4 in the afternoon. And if you know anything about Houston heat, you don't want to be out past 3 o'clock. So when the mayor laid off all these workers, their routes extended. So they were working way beyond. They were working way beyond their routes. And the idea then, when you finished your routes, you went home. Some days you didn't finish in 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 hours. Some days it was more. For example, like the day after Christmas, when everyone's putting all their stuff out on the curb. So these workers struck about that. They were mad. There were a number of things that they were concerned with. Lack of water out there, safety, and in particular, it was this task system. Now, the union that I worked for did not organize a strike. It was a wildcat strike, meaning the workers on their own decided to strike. And in 1949, the Texas legislature passed a law that said public employees could organize unions, but what they couldn't do was strike, and they couldn't bargain collectively. But what it did say is they could do individual work stoppages. So being the union spokesperson, my job was to explain that this was an individual work stoppage and was not a general strike. And it could have been a sick out too as well. In the end, the strike started August 18th. By August 21st, it was over. A number of city council members in solidarity rode garbage trucks. Rodney Ellis, Ernest McGowan, Ben Reyes, Jim Greenwood. I rode a garbage truck with Ernest McGowan, and we bumped garbage for an entire day. You never say never, but I don't ever want to be a garbage man. I'm going to tell you that right now. It was hard. Jim Greenwood had his arm slashed open through glass shards, because you can imagine what people put in garbage cans, and then you go to pick up the bag. You just can't pick up the bag at the top. You have to pick it up like that, because otherwise it could break. And so those council members all rode the garbage trucks. In the end, the mayor fired 91 people. There was a lot of back and forth, a lot of lobbying, a lot of PR, a lot of media, a lot of lobbying, and finally on August 31st, she actually hired 84 of them back. And they were all rehired after she had fired them at least 4 or 5 times for striking under the law. Since then, if you notice who's picking up your garbage now, it's still largely city workers. Some privateering is going on, but it's all mechanical now. So all the business of running along behind a garbage truck, all the danger, there's still some danger there, but most of that is gone now. The life of an average solid waste worker back then was about 40. When you reach 40, you could no longer run behind those trucks and do the heavy lifting. So that was kind of the life of a garbage worker back in 1986. Thank you.
It's really great. Hello, everyone. My name is Yudith Nieto. I am from the east end of Houston, and I work with Texas Environmental Justice Advocacy Services, and we mostly work in those communities that are more impacted by industrial facilities that are considered the front lines in Houston. So I'm going to trace back a little bit before your strike, the garbage strikers, to 1979, where Dr. Bullard first started organizing a community here in Houston around building a waste pit in their community, which was predominantly African American, and that's where the first connection between race and pollution was made in 1979. And then he was, of course, part of different movements, social justice movements, civil rights movements, that led to the environmental justice movement as, a movement. even though that had been happening in the 60s and the 70s through the civil rights movements and the farm workers movements because of all the contamination that they were facing in the fields. So then it became a movement that was recognized by governments and eventually led to signing an executive order by Bill Clinton in 1994. But it wasn't before in 1991 actually holding the first National People of Color Summit where the principles of environmental justice were first written, where it talked about being respectful of those most impacted and including language and stories from those that are most impacted, either from working in the fields or working in facilities that have petrochemical, they're facing petrochemical exposure or other chemical exposures, and then eventually to the communities that are at the front lines. So, this was a whole intersection of movements coming together and building language around what environmental justice was, and then the direct correlation between environmental racism, which was actually a term that was used to describe a community of color, low income, minority, right, global majority, in a sense, that was being impacted by the extraction of fossil fuels or the refining of fossil fuels or even the transportation of fossil fuels or other chemical products. So I'm still learning a lot of the history of where the environmental justice started and the movement started and how I play a role in it. As a young person, I came into the movement in 2012, but really when my family immigrated to the States, because my grandfather was a field worker, he was a farm worker in the 90s and 80s, and decided to move our family to the U.S., but he was able to come here through the Bracero program, which Cesar Chavez and all the other amazing people that were working in the farm workers movement were able to develop for immigrants like my families. And we left our home because of the privatization of water back where we're from, but then ended up in one of the most polluted communities in Houston, which is Manchester, which sits right on the edge of Houston and Pasadena. And if anyone's familiar with those sides of town, you know that you have a lot of contamination of air, water, and soil. And there is not a lot of communication between the industries that produce a lot of those emissions and contribute to those health impacts in those communities. We don't have a real alarm or set program that alerts us when there is an explosion or a leak or anything like that. So that's what our organization sort of focuses on, is building that advocacy in our community so that people can know that they do have a political place in what is happening and in the environmental justice movement. Houston is, the second largest petrochemical industry complex in the world, and so we don't really have an environmental justice policy that could really protect workers inside the plants and also communities outside of it. So it's what we're helping to develop here in Houston, but also learning from a lot of what's been happening in the 60s, 70s, and the 80s with all these other movements and other groups that have been, coming together to build this. But I think my time is up, and I can say more, but I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
I'm Michael Botson, and the topic of my brief talk is Wife's Words Speak for Houston Labor Crusader. A number of years ago, as I prepared to enjoy the Labor Day holiday, I was reminded of those who made this long weekend possible. I'm not thinking about legendary labor leaders of the 20th century, like the fiery John L. Lewis, who led the miners' union, Walter Reuther of the auto workers, or Crystal Lee Sutton of the textile workers, perhaps better known as Norma Ray, as played by Sally Field in her Academy Award-winning role in the movie Norma Ray. I'm thinking about the idealistic workaday people like Houston's Forrest Henry, and the price he and his family paid for the benefits we take for granted. Mr. Henry worked for the used tool company in the 1930s and 1940s. Caught up in the crusade to bring justice to the shop floor during the Great Depression, he joined the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO, when its representatives came to organize workers at the used tool company. Inspired by President Roosevelt's support of labor's rights and the National Labor Relations Act of 1935 that protected a worker's right to join a union, Mr. Henry committed himself to the labor cause. Management at the used tool company militantly opposed the federal government and labor unions meddling in its labor affairs and did everything in its power to undermine the basic rights promised by the National Labor Relations Act. But ultimately, workers' desire for representation won out and used tool unionized. But there were many casualties in the struggle, and Forrest Henry was one of them. While rummaging through my cluttered desk before that Labor Day, I happened across a letter from Forrest Henry's wife, Azurra, to David McDonald, the vice president of the CIO, dated June 28, 1950. I copied the letter years ago while doing research at the Steelworkers Archive at Penn State University. I want to share that letter with you. Mrs. Henry's poignant words convey the sacrifices that she and her family made many years ago so we could enjoy our long holiday weekend. Dear Mr. McDonald, I don't usually interfere in my husband's affairs, but I believe you will admit that no real mother would stand idly while she sees her children facing real hardship. Please forgive me. My husband, F.T. Henry, who worked as staff representative in District 37, was laid off last July 15th and has not been able to get regular employment since. It seems though his past connections with and for the CIO is the stumbling block. On April 1st, 1944, he was fired from the used tool company plant for what his fellow workers say was very plainly union activity. His fellow union workers gave him his full salary every week until he drew his full paycheck from the steelworkers on May 1st, 1944. His discharge case was not processed against the used tool company because District Director Hardesty said he would rather have him on staff. He went to work for the union on April 12, 1944, and was there until July 15, 1949. Whenever he applies for a job now and mentions his discharge from the used tool company and his work as an organizer for the CIO, he is told that there is no opening, but he can come back later. While my husband was working for the union, we did not save much money. He was always heading some drive telling me that he was helping to make contacts and publicity for the union. He has headed drives for the Red Cross, Community Chest, YMCA, Boy Scouts, NAACP, and other agencies here. He started a political league here after a trip to Pittsburgh when you all told him to get active in politics. To my knowledge, he has put over $500 of his own money up to get this league started. It is now the largest among Negro people here. I'm sending you clippings from the Houston Informer and Pittsburgh Courier about their recent banquet. We have 7 children to support, and things are not going well at all. Can't you place him somewhere or help him get a job, as we need to make some money badly? He is an exceptionally good speaker, but will do any kind of work to support us. I hate to bother you with this, but I've heard my husband say so many good things about you, and I believe you will help us. Respectfully yours, Mrs. Azurra Henry.
Hello, my name is David Otoya. I'm a member of the International Association of Machinists. I'm also employed by United Airlines for the last... Sure, I'm sorry. My name is David Otoya. I'm a member of the International Association of Machinists. I'm employed also by United Airlines. I was part of a organizing drive whenever United Airlines merged with Continental. The merge involved over 32,000 members, which were ramp agents, ticket counters, reservations. And the stories that I have to tell you guys is how the company, all the negative campaign that we had to go up against the company. I mean, the company was They didn't want to give us raises or anything, but then again, they would pay millions of dollars to anti-union companies to organize against us. They would promise at the point when we started organizing, they didn't want to give us raises, but immediately after we started organizing, they started giving us raises. They would start giving us pizzas and all these different things, just for us not to bring in a union. Like the sister was saying, they would call the law. They would, fire us, layoffs in order for the union not to come in. But and it took a while. It took a couple of years because it wasn't just here in Houston. Because United Airlines also based in Chicago, San Francisco, so we had to organize in all these different states. So there was a lot of traveling involved. But at the end of the day, we won. You had to win 50 plus 1, and we did weigh that. But it wasn't easy to get there. Like I said, there was a lot of. They would call the police if we were outside educating the members, giving out information. They would turn on the sprinklers. Nobody got arrested, but the police was out there. Also, in Chicago, where they're more union strong than us, but slowly but surely here we're getting there. There was arrests there. But again, it's a big company that wasn't willing to respect, our decision to bring in a union. But at the end of the day, like I said, we did it. There was different departments involved. I'm a ramp agent, brings in the planes, upload and download the planes. So that department alone was like 14,000 of us. So we organized them first. It took like 2-3 years. Then we organized reservations, and then we organized ticket counters. But it was a process of about 6 years. What did the company start doing, for instance, was sending our work overseas. One good example is reservations. The phone calls, they started closing down the reservations buildings, and then the calls were now going to Central America, and there were cheaper labor over there. So once we organized and, we have a contract now, they're not allowed to outsource any of our work. But, again, I don't think people realize what a union can do for you, but it takes a lot to finally bring in a union. But we finally did it. And like I said, in overall, it's 32,000 members at the union gain, and everybody's union strong now. Thank you.
So hi, my name is Maria. I'm with Fe Justicia Worker Center. I will be presenting a case of Rockwell, which is a company here in Houston, which their main offices and main headquarters are in Alabama. So to introduce ourselves, Fe Justicia Worker Center is a safe space for workers to learn about their rights and organize to improve their working conditions. The programs we do offer is labor justice, immigration, labor trafficking, health and safety, domestic, and with the domestic workers we work as well. So Rockwell is a company based in Alabama and specializes in the insulation industry for houses, buildings, and air conditioning system. We had 7 workers of the company which we invited to our workshop, or our health and system workshop. The main objective, our main objective was for them to identify the different risks that they were facing in the workplace. They were thought of the risk mapping system, which from there on they did identify different risks that they had in the workplace. Our process, what we did do a claim to the Department of Labor, the Equal Employment Opportunity for Discrimination, and another one with OSHA. The workers did take pictures and other evidence they had, so that way we could prove what we were fighting for. Some of the things that were proved that they had as risks and they identified, they did recognize that they were victims of different kinds of abuse. Victims of wage theft, verbal abuse. They suffered of stress by the big pressure given by the employer. 2 workers had an accident with machines. One lost his fingers. Another one was injured on his head by a door of the machine that opened and hit him. On several occasions, the rotating Give me a second. The rotating cutting knives were out, and they did hit some of the employees. The forklift and the load amounts on them were in very poor conditions. They were without brakes. There were gas leaks on these forklifts, and as well leaks of hydraulic oil. The company had never given training on how to use these machines. The forklifts alone, or any health and safety workshops, I do apologize. They were victims of discrimination. The women were victims of sexual harassment. The bathrooms were in very poor conditions. There was mold everywhere. It was so disgusting they could not sit on them as well. Many accumulation of materials in high altitude of very heavy materials up to more than 600 pounds. Whenever OSHA did provide an inspection to the facility, which March 16, OSHA did stop the production and requires to the employers to provide safety equipment, fix the machines, and make medical examinations to workers to identify pollution in their lungs. The reaction of the employer after OSHA did provide the inspection, he did tell his employees that OSHA was only federal and not with immigration, that they were in risk of being deported. As well, after that, we did a claim to the Department of Labor. On April 15, our Bus of Justice, we did a protest outside of the company. The aim of the protest was to let our Rockwell know that employees still have the entitled to protest and organize. Some of the help we did receive from inside from the employees was that they stopped working that same day, so it helped us out a lot. What the manager did, he called the police. He refused to accept the letters we had mailed to the headquarters as well himself. And after that, after all the process and all the hard work that our employees did from Rockwell, one of the cases we did win with Fe Justicia by one of the employees who was working, Mireya, they did a complaint of $6,000 that was on wage theft for one of the workers. We did win the case. OSHA fined the Rockwell headquarters, the company, with $89,925, as well with the employment agency. They were saying Rockwell was saying they were not the ones giving employment to the employers that were processing the claim. So they used to wash their hands by saying that another agency was the one who hired them. So that agency as well got fined with $25,000. And Brandon, the manager, who was currently there, was fired by the company, and there's currently a new manager working now. So, thank you.
My name is Xinachtli Alvaro Luna Hernandez. I am 64 years old. For the last 14 years, I have been continue to be held, in long-term solitary confinement, what prison officials call administrative segregation, what those of us who live it call torture. I am currently in a cell 6 feet by 9 feet, and I do not remember the last time I saw the sun. As some of you know, prisoners in Texas and Alabama are currently striking in rolling work stoppages. The strike is set to go national on September 9th, the anniversary of the Attica uprising. I cannot leave the cell except for the occasional rec time, so I cannot join my brothers and sisters in work stoppage strike action, buried as I am in the bowels of the belly of the beast. Yes, they have buried me, but they didn't know I was a seed. Today, I wish to tell you the story of another prison strike I helped lead, this one at Ellis Unit in Huntsville, Texas, not far from Houston, in 1978. Our work stoppage began on October 5th, 1978, the first day of the Ruiz Estelle trial, which would go on to become the landmark ruling regarding prison abuses in Texas. My own lawsuit, which I represented myself as a jailhouse lawyer, would go on to be rolled into the Supreme Court ruling given by the appropriately named Judge Justice. We had spent months radicalizing prisoners to join our strike action. This was no easy feat. At the time, prisons in Texas were completely racially segregated. My pod and work crew was all Hispanic, but we managed to use our limited interaction with Black and even some white prisoners to organize the strike. The guards, of course, were all white men. I'm no stranger to police and guard racism and brutality, having been severely beaten by them multiple times and having watched as a racist cop shot my best friend, Hervé Ramos, in the back of the head. The pigs never even interviewed me about his death. On October 5th, 1978, I was part of the second group of work crews that was supposed to go out into the fields to work as legal plantation slaves under the lash of the new plantation drivers, the prison guards. But not today. Me and my Black and Latino brothers would not pick cotton driven by white men on horses with whips at their side. As previously arranged, once we knew the first crews were out in the field, we would lay it down and begin a sit-in at the back gate instead of getting on the bus that would take us out into the cotton fields. We laid it down, and soon enough, the guards, and eventually the warden, Bob Cousins, you may remember him as the warden in the Steve McQueen film, The Getaway. We were asked who was in charge, and I stood up, having been nominated by my revolutionary brothers as the leader of our work crew. I read our demands, and I'm sad to say they were very much the same as the demands striking prisoners are making in 2016. An end to double and triple selling, guards using prisoner trustees or building tenders to spy on us and beat us, access to adequate health care, sanitary living and working conditions, including decent food and enough of it. We would work all day in the fields and only be fed a slice of bologna when we came back. We had effectively taken over the yard. Our work stoppage was by necessity also a hunger strike, as the guards would bring us no food. The only water we had were bottles passed to us through the bars by other inmates. We were near the wooden ramps that were used to push the laundry carts full of dirty laundry to be washed, since we would all strip naked there out in the yard before going to shower, dirty as we usually were returning to the fields. That night, to stay warm, we tore down those ramps and used them to set bonfires. Those bonfires didn't just warm our bodies, they fueled our revolutionary fervor as we discussed the theory and practice of universal liberation. Even prisoners who had previously refused strike action eventually joined us, moved by our defiant spirit. In 1978, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice couldn't deny our strike was happening, as they have done in 2016, because we had used our media mail to send confidential letters to the press. Their helicopters circled above us, carrying footage of our strike far beyond the razor wire. At one point, the warden came to me and offered some small concessions if we would stop. I pretended to agree, but when he paraded me around the unit, instead of telling people to go back to work, I used it as an opportunity to tell my brothers to keep striking. The strike lasted 3 weeks. In the end, for my leadership role, I was moved to death row. Administrative segregation didn't yet exist, so there I was held in solitary confinement conditions for the next 5 years for my role in the strike.
The International Women's Year was in 1977. They said that this organization, the National Women's Caucus for Art, that people were starting chapters all over the country. A woman who lived in Montrose, she said she would have a meeting at her house the next week or shortly. After that, I remember feeling very excited to meet the women who I'd seen their work, but I hadn't met them in person. And just knowing there were these women that were going to meet, and that there was something collective that we could do. Because in a community like this, there are only a handful of jobs in the arts, as teaching in one of the universities or working in the museums. There are a whole lot more artists than there are people that have institutional support. Many of the women in our group were home, at home with children, small children, and doing their own work, even in their kitchens, and not knowing anyone or being able to talk with anyone or discuss art or our career in any way. So it was a momentous thing for all of those women. I know Martha Terrell told me she cried all the way home after that meeting, and I was very excited and enthusiastic. So the meeting occurred the following week, and I had been tracking, and some of them knew too, because we had been pressured to donate to the Channel 8 auction. There was a lot of pressure on the artists in the community to donate to that auction. And then we really discovered that it was, it was a very high figure for their annual budget that we were affording them. And we were getting virtually nothing out of it. And we were supposed to feel honored to give up our work that we struggled to make and weren't being paid for. And I thought it was outrageous, just outrageous. And I raised the issue, and everyone, it was just universal, like, yes, let's do that. And so we agreed we were going to boycott the Channel 8 auction. And we agreed at that moment, it was like we all discovered that collectively we could do something that we had not been able to do, even though we were not happy about what was going on. That collectively we could speak out against this art auction, and we could write a press release, and we could say we were going to boycott it, and we would encourage other artists to do the same and point out all the things that were wrong with it. And we were all thinking of various things. Because the artists in the community are some of the lowest paid people in the community. I don't think people realize that. We're educated, but we're not. We're not paid. So it was important that we stand up for what we did, and that we call attention to the fact that there were people in the community. My example was the dentist could give a free root canal. I think I needed a root canal at the time. And I thought, why aren't they donating? If this is so important to their children and everybody in the community, why does it fall on the backs of artists? And so we made that as a strong part of the conversation and the issue. But in fact, it caused a huge storm, and the board was very upset. And I think they made concessions. I think they went on with it, but we didn't participate, and many artists didn't participate for that year. And I don't know when it actually stopped, but it started to stop when we stopped being exploited by them. I think they offered us a minimum bid and a % of the sales. But, it wasn't set up to, even when they did it and had been doing it, it was denigrating. So, I think for a lot of reasons, the artists in the community really needed to speak up about that. And I think it gave us a collective voice. And certainly our group learned a lot from that experience, because all of a sudden, somebody on these boards that were very powerful were very upset that we were not going to participate. And that wouldn't have happened if we hadn't done that. So that the next time we said something, we had a stronger voice. And we kept getting a stronger collective voice. And as a group, we could do more. We did other things that were, we tried very hard to be completely ethical and democratic. And we were not forming that organization just to show our own work and promote ourselves. We were trying to promote art in the community and a fair treatment of artists generally. And it wasn't just women, we included men in that. So, a lot of the male artists were very grateful for a lot of the things that came out of a lot of our activities. So, a good 4 or 5 years of pretty, confrontational behavior. And it was very clear very early on, because we had a city councilman, I got the old firehouse for like $1 a year or something, and we had a space to meet. But we didn't just show our work in that space. It was about using it as headquarters, really. You know, we're not just not part of a culture or part of a social system. How are things working in other social systems? And it was more difficult for artists because we weren't collective in any way to have a voice, a collective voice. Not an art voice, but a collective voice that would help integrate us, you know, into the city and into the life of the city in a meaningful way, you know, not just get our work out or show our work. I mean, I was involved in local politics to a certain extent, and certainly, you know, one of the things that happened, that was in the late 60s or 70s, is that it was called Citizens for Good Schools, and they wanted the school board changed, and they wanted the education of their children to be better. And I was involved with that group, and they talked about all the things they had to do to make that happen. And the first thing they did was to find a slate of officers to run for the school board. And then they had press releases. I mean, it's just watching democracy in action, you know. And if you get involved in any kind of collective activity, you learn those skills. But they're only, you know, they're not powerful as just an individual in the same way they are in a group. And this is a really great example of how people that were dispersed, not being connected in any way that would help all of us, you know, get more integrated into the cultural life of the city and have a voice in it. We really protested. I mean, we had that was beginning when it was the Arts Council. We were down there trying to do something about that. They were, you know, it was like a self-perpetuating board, and it was taking public money. And we challenged that the board should make all the nominations, and there should be outside nominations to the board of directors of the Houston Art Alliance. And so they said no, they wouldn't do it. And so we duly nominated people. And then they were having the big election, and it was just their slate of candidates, you know. But they invited Hoving, who was then director of the Met, to come and speak. And we all went. And we were, you know, I mean, we had nominated people. And so, and they said something about them. I mean, I raised my hand and I said, you know, I move that we, you know, put the people that we had nominated on the ballot, that we duly nominated on the ballot. And then that was a huge embarrassment. And then somebody seconded it, and we all yelled yes. And so then they met for, you know, in a little huddle, and then they came back and said no, that they wouldn't allow us to put our candidates on that we had duly nominated. And I swear, and everybody thinks I did not do this, but we got up in unison and walked out, and it was not planned. And it was a huge embarrassment to the Arts Council, and particularly since Hoving was sitting there watching this whole thing. I think other people and groups need to speak together, you know. I mean, I was not the sole voice of the Women's Caucus for Art. I was a leader, but, you know, I didn't do that. But when I saw somebody get up, I was on my feet and walking out, and I don't even know who first stood up, but we all walked out. I mean, I had 100 people walk out spontaneously. It was really great. They were passionate about it. All we wanted were for things to be fair, and for artists' voices to be heard and included, and for people to be on that Art Alliance board that represented artists. And some of the people we put forward were elected the next time around. Well, planning a big action, and doing a press release, and then following through someplace where it's fair and where there's a bad point, and getting as many artists as you can to sign on to it, can do it. I mean, we proved it. You can do it, and people are not, you know, going to turn their backs on that.
Sorry, could you guys say your names in order since I didn't do that?
Sorry. My name is Elsa Caballero.
My name is Richard Shaw.
Yudith Nieto.
Michael Botson.
David Otoya.
Maria Giron.
Azurra Crispino, speaking on behalf of Xinachtli, Alvaro, Luna Hernandez.
Now we're open to Q&A, or if anybody also brought a story that they'd like to contribute.
Thanks. Very important to the labor organizing in Houston, Texas, was the role of the Communist Party in organizing the CIO locals here in Houston. And I've done some research on it. There's not a lot known about it. But the 1937, the National Maritime Union in Galveston was organized by the Communist Party. It was the first union agreement in the country that provided for non-discrimination in hiring and pay for African Americans. Any member who discriminated against African Americans could be kicked out and couldn't work on U.S. ships. Of the 6 national officers for the National Maritime Union, only the president, Joseph Curran, did not belong to the Communist Party. They had a union newspaper called The Pilot. The editor and assistant editors were Communist Party members. The Communist Party was involved in the strike of 1939 with the National Maritime Union against Standard Oil here in Houston. The Communist Party also helped organize used tools down on Leland Street. The Communist Party ran a shop newspaper, a bi-weekly in 1936, called The Fighting Used Worker. It was a mimeographed in the home of CP member P.F. Kennedy and distributed at the gates by non-workers at that plant. The company hired Pinkerton Detective Agency to spy on party workers at the plant. Kennedy later became the head of the Texas Communist Party from 38 to 42. The Texas State Industrial Union Council, which is the Texas affiliate of the CIO, was headed up by Communist Party members from its founding in June 20th, 1937 until 1941. Then one of the most famous Communist Party organizers was Emma Tanayuka. She founded 2 international ladies garment workers unions and led the 12,000 member strike of the pecan workers in San Antonio. She was an organizer for the Workers' Alliance of America and the Women's League for Peace and Freedom. In 1937, she organized protests against the beatings of Mexican immigrants by U.S. Border Patrol agents. She was first arrested at the age of 16 and later became head of the Communist Party here in Houston, Texas. In 1935, the Communist Party of Texas published the Red Trade Unionist, a monthly newspaper 10 pages long. Late in the 1940s, they did another newspaper called the Texas Spur. The FTA union, it's the Food, Tobacco, and Agricultural and Allied Workers of America, was led by Jack Fry, a Texas CP member. Their headquarters was here in Houston. Another Communist Party-led union in Houston was the United Cannery, Agricultural, and Packing Allied Workers, based in Houston. By 1942, it had won 5 contracts covering 600 African American and Hispanic compress workers in Houston. The Baytown strike against Humble Oil was supported by the Sabine branch of the Communist Party, and they helped to bring members from the National Maritime Union, African American members from Houston to rally for support for integrated unions there as well. The platform at the time of the party is they proposed for Texas a minimum wage, an 8-hour day, adequate old age pensions, low interest state loans to landless farmers and agricultural workers, the application of the Wagner Labor Relations Act to farm workers, state income tax, abolition of the poll tax, abolition of the white primary, civil rights for African American and Mexican American members.
Okay. I wanted to share this book with y'all. It's by Gilbert and Mers. It's called Working the Waterfront. And I have a short story to read from it, very short story if you're interested. Anyway, this guy was a radical union dock worker, longshoreman in Houston, and worked at some other ports between New Orleans and Corpus Christi. And So this is back in the 1930s. The Depression is going on. It's like a 12-level chess game. There's so many different unions and then different factions in the unions, and it gets very dramatic, just like that film On the Waterfront, you know, with Marlon Brando. Could have been a contender. And so there's a lot of violence going on, a lot of thuggery between these unions, you know, for dominance, and even between the different radical factions. There's communists, there's wobblies, which are, you know, more anarchists. Gilbert Merz started off as a communist and became a wobbly, I think, around the time of World War II. And I'll just share this with you real quick. Can you hold that for me? Let's see. Okay, so this is about the tension between the rank and file workers and the union bosses. The International Seamen's Union was in trouble and its leaders were reacting violently. It was said that Dave Grange, head of the Maritime Cooks and Stewards Department, was preserving order in New York headquarters meetings with a six-shooter in his hand instead of a gavel. Beef squads were visible around union offices. How these goons were supported, I never learned, since some remained on the beach for months at a time. They had to have income from somewhere. They did no work ashore. A reasonable supposition is that they were sorted by union funds one way or another. They operated on the theory that a dissenter with a broken arm was likely to do less mouthing off after his accident. Let's see, beef squads. Select group, this is in a Houston office, was huddled around in a Houston union office and whispering. Somebody overheard them speaking that they were going to bring 2 carloads of goons down to Port Arthur to take over the hall. Taking over a local ISU branch in this fashion was not that extraordinary an event. International Union headquarters would already have provided one of the groups of takeoverers with credentials as court agents, likewise others as patrolmen or whatever, to the number normally administering union business there. The new agent would carry a statement from the International Union officers saying that present officers were being suspended for cause pending trial or something of that sort. That took care of legality. The massive union's membership was at sea except in time of strike or lockout. The average union seaman in average times was on a ship somewhere in the high seas. His union business was administered in whatever port he found himself in, where the union maintained an office. Members ashore waiting to ship out or simply taking it easy for a spell did most of the governing of local branches, subject to international union rules. So it was quite possible for a small group of men to take charge of a local branch by physically ousting that branch's office staff and cowering the members ashore. Our eavesdropper made note of personal cars, license plates, and managed a phone call to Port Arthur. By sheerest coincidence, I was sitting in the Port Arthur branch office talking to Agent Arthur Thomas when the call came through. Thomas told me in one breath what had come over the phone, then stepped from his office into the meeting hall where a half-dozen seamen were lounging around. "There's trouble brewing for the hall, men. We want every damn hand here in this hall in 30 minutes. You take this section, you take that." He assigned each sailor his area for spreading the word. In a little while, about 60 men on the beach had gathered in the hall. Agent Thomas quickly informed the men of what he was in the wind, made an estimate of the goon squad's arrival. He arrived at the men he advised the men of their defense, that their defense should not be made in the hall, but that the attacking party should be met on the street. "No use having our hall torn up for the likes of these buzzards," he told them. He suggested dividing the squads of so many under each squad leader. The suggestion was adopted and squad leaders elected. These then huddled to lay out their respective positions on the streets. Clubs but no firearms was the caution. To cut the story short, there was a brawl in the parking lot, and several carloads of these goons wound up in the hospital.
I want to say thank you again. I think it's really a privilege and important to get to add another perspective to the sort of imagination of what Houston is as a city and what's happened here. And I'm again so grateful to each of you and just honored and humbled to get to learn about y'all's experiences. And our documentation partner is the wonderful Alex in Houston Media Source, so that the stories that have been shared around this table also have a chance to be spread beyond it.
Thank you, Carrie, for organizing.
Yeah. Did any of y'all have anything to add that you didn't quite get to go to, or questions for the other storytellers at all before we finish?
Well, I'd just like to say thank you, and it was fascinating to me to hear all the labor pieces. I don't think this has ever been done before over the years. And there's still a lot of labor history to go, by the way, guys. Stay tuned.
And I would just like to add that, we're all here because I think in labor, right, we want to work on economic justice. But, again, I want to emphasize how important it is for us to also really deepen our work in our racial justice work, because it's clear, very clear, if you really look at the way it's working, is that as we're working to try to raise wages for workers, racial justice has a lot to play. So, when you really look at how wages are being put forth now, even though we've done a lot of work to get contracts to get workers' wages up, still when you compare to with the classes of race, the inequality is there. So one cannot go without the other.